Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. Aren't you grateful for another day? It's a beautiful day outside. Um, Sorry, my cell phone starts ringing right in the start video. All right, so we're going to talk today about Vietnam. Let me see here. Change that. There we go. On Friday, we talked about President Johnson and his Great Society and his wonderful plans for domestic reform, some of which were good, some of which were just overdone. Talking about the Civil Rights Act and all the great progress that he helped to initiate there, but also things like judicial, what was the term we used? Judicial activism, that was it. Okay, but today we're going to look at Vietnam specifically and how the war progressed in Vietnam. Now, if you remember correctly, back to the previous chapter, we talked about the fact that both Korea and Vietnam have been divided after World War II into two separate countries, part of which was ruled by communism and part which was free. The north part was the communist part in both Vietnam and in Korea, and the south is the free part. That's why Tom is from South Korea, where they are free. North Korea is ruled by Kim Jong-un, who apparently is very sick lately. So interesting little side note there, and we will keep an eye on that and see what that is going to mean for negotiations moving forward with North Korea. But let's go back to Vietnam for now. Okay, so in Vietnam, when we had left off there, the United States was trying desperately to establish a good, solid government in South Vietnam that could remain free of communists, establish a republic. But the more that we tried to free ourselves in South Vietnam, the more entangled we became until it was eventually a full-fledged war. Remember, I think it was Kennedy had moved troops in. And it may have even been Truman who moved. I think Truman moved him in, and then Kennedy increased the number of troops. Johnson is going to increase them even more. What happened was in the summer of '64, there was an issue in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is the body of water right off the coast of North Korea. It is south of China, right where North Korea is. In the Gulf of Tonkin, there was a ship called the Maddox, a United States ship that was apparently attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. It was not a major incident. I believe only one person died and a few were injured. But as a result of it, Johnson asked Congress to pass what is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And that basically gave the president power to respond to any attack in Vietnam against the United States. He increased the number of troops there so that by the end of 1968, close to over half a million troops, United States troops, were in Vietnam. And they'll remain there for several years. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But they're expanding the role of the American troops, and it was a bad time. All right, so this war, why is Vietnam so different than Korea or World War II or anything? It has several factors here, and we're going to go through, I believe there's 5. We're going to go through 5 factors about why this war was so much more difficult for the Americans and more difficult than we even really thought it should be. Remember, we are one of the world's only 2 superpowers at this point. Why are we having such a difficult time in this little nation of Vietnam? 5 reasons. First of all, there's not a clear-cut conflict between the 2 separate nations. What does that mean? Well, in the North, we have the communists in control, but in the South, we have a corrupt government, and we have that's ruling all of South Vietnam. But then you have the cities who want freedom, and the countryside, who are basically controlled by what's called the Viet Cong. And these are communist sympathizers. The Viet Cong are communist sympathizers. They want communism in South Korea. They want to reunite with North Korea and make everything right. And you can't tell them apart. They're all Vietnamese people. You can't look at one person and go, oh, he's a Viet Cong. He's wants a republic. You can't tell by looking. So they easily hid themselves. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that the communist forces were being supplied not only by China and Russia, which we knew about those, but we also know that they were being supplied through Laos and Cambodia, two countries close by. Well, and a lot of what was coming in from Laos and Cambodia was ultimately from Russia and China. But in order to stop it and cut off those supplies, we would have to literally attack those other countries. And American political leaders, we're not going to go for that. We are not. You can see here on this map, here's Cambodia, here's Laos. We can't attack these countries just because they're supplying to North and South, to North Korea and into the Viet Cong, because that would mean we'd be spreading and escalating this war even more than it already was. Okay, the next reason, the third reason that this war is just not unwinnable, but so much more difficult. The government of South Vietnam was, we already talked about this a little bit, corrupt, undemocratic, and unstable. Some thought, yeah, it's better than the communists, but it wasn't really, because it was corrupt, undemocratic, and unstable. Yes, ultimately, anything's better than communism, but you get the point here. It's the corruption in that government made it very difficult for us to fight a war that we could win. The fourth reason, civilian leadership wanted to micromanage the war. And isn't this the way Congress is doing even right now in our current crisis? They want to micromanage our crisis and tell us when we can open stores and when we can't. But let's go back to Vietnam. When civilian leadership thinks they know better than the military experts, then we've got a problem. Because the civilian leadership were affected by politics and elections, and well, the American public thinks this because of some poll result, so we're going to do this. And military leaders realize we cannot control war by how American polls turn out from week to week. And the last reason, number 5, the last reason that this war was so difficult for us was that President Johnson was committed to keeping it limited, a limited defensive war. And that limitation, because he didn't want to have to divert funds from his Great Society projects to win a war in Vietnam, because of that, he it was never going to be enough. He could not give enough money to the war effort and give enough soldiers to the war effort for it to really be successful. He did not want Vietnam to affect the American state where we were at that point economically, or his social agenda. So the war turned out to be quite a nightmare for Americans. We did rely quite a bit on their superior firepower. Many of you have probably heard of a product called Agent Orange. Agent Orange was a chemical used in the jungles of Vietnam to kill off the jungle so that people couldn't hide. Viet Cong specifically, or other communist forces couldn't hide in the jungles. But American exposure to those chemicals in Vietnam has left many Vietnam vets with cancer or other health issues as a result of being exposed to Agent Orange. The whole thing was just a nightmare. The thing is, let's get through Tet Offensive first. So what happened in the Tet Offensive, this was really a dramatic turning point for the war. it had some initial success, but what it is the Tet Offensive was, Tet is the Vietnam New Year, um, according to their calendar. So there was going to be a great big celebration in Vietnam because of the New Year, but the Viet Cong took weapons into cities and staged coups, or overthrows, if you want to call them that, riots in major places all up and down through South Vietnam. Um, and they had the support of communists of the North Vietnamese to come in and help them. What had happened was, up until this point, the government had tightly controlled what anybody in the United States knew about the war. We all thought, not we because I wasn't alive then, um, but in America, everybody thought, well, everything's going great and no problems. We're winning this war. And then all of a sudden, the Tet Offensive comes along, where hundreds of Americans are dead. We had to gain back a lot of territory that we had already won. Lots and lots of problems. And Americans go, well, wait a minute. We thought everything was great. And now you're telling us it's not? So this was like a wake-up call for the Americans to suddenly realize that war is not a good place to be, okay? They did eventually drive back the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. They gained back the territory, but it took weeks, and it took many American lives. And it turned the media and the American people against the war. So after the Tet Offensive, this happened in January of 1968, many Americans simply just wanted a way out. They wanted out of Vietnam. So because of that, in May of 1968, the Paris Peace Talks began. They began arguing over what type of table. Literally, yes, they spent weeks arguing over the shape of the table. So obviously this wasn't going to happen very quickly. But neither side would compromise on anything. The peace talks are going to drag on for 5 years. And we will get to the rest of that later. Okay? 5 years while the fighting continues. There was no ceasefire. There was no armistice, nothing like that. The fighting drags on for 5 more years until Nixon will finally end it in the early 70s. Okay? So that is Vietnam, and that is why it has been so difficult and so such a sore spot for so many Americans. But our Vietnam vets still deserve our respect. They endured some horrible conditions in Vietnam. Okay, look for your quiz. Make sure you have taken your notes and keep those with you for your quiz, okay?